Toxic masculinity, what does that mean? We probably never heard anybody say anything like, well, he objectifies women, therefore I feel like he's a real man. Nobody says that. But instead of saying objectifying women, what are some of the things that we hear in the community where we're talking about, oh, he's a real one because he objectifies women? He's a pimp, he's a player, he got hoes, he got bitches, right?
I was born black and a woman. I am trying to become the strongest person I can become, to live the life I have been given, and to help effect change toward a livable future for this earth and for my children. As a black, lesbian, feminist, socialist, poet, mother of two, including one boy and member of an interracial couple, I usually find myself part of some group in which the majority defines me as deviant, difficult, inferior, or just plain wrong. From my membership in all of these groups, I have learned that oppression and the intolerance of difference come in all shapes and sizes and colors and sexualities, and that among those of us who share the goals of liberation and a workable future for our children, there can be no hierarchies of oppression.
Hey, nice to see y'all. I wanted to make another video about pop culture stuff, despite all of the moral posturing online. I just wanted to say, before I got too deep into the topic that I wanted to address, that the personal is always political.
The book that I've written that most tried to frame my concern with popular culture to a more general audience is the collection of essays, Outlaw Culture. And in the beginning of that book, what I say is that students from different, class backgrounds and ethnicities would come to my classes, and I would want them to read all this metalinguistic theory and of difference and otherness, and they would say, well, what does this have to do with our lives? And I found continually that if I took a movie and said, well, did you go see this movie, and how do you think about it? And I related something very concrete in popular culture to the kind of theoretical paradigms that I was trying to share with them through various work. People seem to grasp it more, and not only that, it would seem to be much more exciting and much more interesting for everybody. Because popular culture has that power in everyday life.
People aren't picking Kendrick and Drake over Gaza. They're capable of walking and chewing gum at the same time. It's also anti-black and reductive to assume that hip-hop is not political or that this beef is not a deeper conversation. Hip-hop has been a voice for the voiceless since its inception, and we can and should speak up about what's happening in culture, along with what's happening in the world. I think it's arrogant to act as if music is not a part of the struggle.
Now Palestinian hip-hop is all over the world, and this is where it started, so I gotta appreciate that.
مين إرهابي؟ أنا إرهابي؟ كيف إرهابي وأنا عايش ببلادي؟ مين إرهابي؟ أنت إرهابي، ماكلني وأنا عايش ببلادي.
Palestinian adults and children are singing in Gaza and Rafah right now.
أنا بنت صغيرة فلسطينية لسه بعمر الورد قلبي طيب وصافي ولا عم بأذي حد أنا بنت صغيرة فلسطينية لسه بعمر الورد قلبي طيب وصافي ولا عم بأذي حد بعرف بيتي وبعرف أرضي أهلي محلاهم حوالي وما بدي بلاقي حدي أهلي محلاهم حوالي إجا كم مجرم على بلدتنا قتلوا بي وأخذوا بي صاروا يقولوا الأرض إلنا صدمة شو بكت عينينا بصرخ أنا شو سوت ما حد جاوب عليك بس مكتوب على باب البيت من هنا مرة الصهيوني من هالمرة بقول اليهوديين من مرة الصهيونيين من بعديها الحجر مسكته ورميته وانا مالي قوي من بعديها الحجر مسكته ورميته وانا مالي قوي مين بيرضى بهذا العار اسمع صوتي يا بشري يلي مثله بهذا العار اسمع صوتي يا بشري.
They're dancing and keeping up morale.
زريف الطول ارسم يا زمن صورة للقدس ضرة للوطن في أبهى الألوان المشهد ملون في 4 ألوان عاش
So who are we to say we are above that? Don't piss me off with that shit. Rest, but don't quit. It's called struggle for a reason. But a revolution without joy is no revolution at all. This is a part of why I wanted to do a video about Emma Goldman.
Emma Goldman, I think I'm Emma Goldman. Used to write for Karl Marx, then I met Emma Goldman.
Which is still coming eventually when I have better work-life balance. But the reason I wanted to do an Emma Goldman video was because of one of her most prolific quotes. She was once at an anarchist meeting and started dancing freely. Everyone was staring at her like she was causing a disturbance. Two men came up to her and told her that she wasn't a serious activist because she was dancing. In anger, she whipped over to them and said, "If I can't dance, I don't want to be a part of your revolution."
Next time you fucking use a birth control pill, thank Emma.
If we can't dance, if we can't be free, if we can't love, fuck, etc., then what is all this for? I think a lot of us still have to unpack a lot of the Puritan conditioning we've been forced into, because it is a part of every activist movement in America. And it's because we were taught that there's no pleasure in what's right. That's a lie.
There's an us before the wound, there's an us before oppression. And to me, pleasure is a way that we tap down into that. I'm like, when I'm having an orgasm, I'm not like, slavery, you know, I'm like, you might be my slave, but you know, like in a good way. It's really about like, oh, I feel very free. To me, the work was about like, how do we remind people that you were free to begin with? You were always free to begin with.
I saw a tweet the other day that said, we're gonna be fucking and doing drugs in the revolution. And like, period. We will be.
So my dad taught me that love is warm, kind, gentle, and committed, and my mum taught me that love is community, hope, and survival. That love is not just warm, fluffy feelings and joyful experiences. Love can also be personal pain transformed into social good. It is the energy we need to sustain us through the frustration of trying to create change. Therefore, given isolation, competition, and exclusion, love is genuine dialogue. Given the existence of power, love is resistance. Given the existence of privilege, love is solidarity. So joining with others, across difference, being allies. Given the existence of inequality, love is liberation. Given the existence of harm, love is redress, how we help people to find justice, to make an unfair situation fair. So indeed, love has a magical, mysterious, mystical essence, but it also needs to be concrete and grounded in everyday actions and interactions. This is my view. And these interactions are never finished. We can always become more or less loving than we are now. So my view is that if love is genuine dialogue, listening to the most marginalized, and understanding that's not a fixed thing, that that's shifting and changing all the time, who we see as the most marginalized. And if love is joining them in their struggle for liberation, then I believe that not only can we love people that we work with, but this love can move us into action, into challenging all forces that work against it.
I saw a video the other day of people listening to Sukiyana at the Palestinian protests. We can contain multitudes. I keep making this joke, but I feel like y'all weren't paying attention to everything everywhere all at once. Because of the recent bullshit with Drake and now Diddy, I wanted to talk about abuse and patriarchy. This isn't separate from Gaza, Sudan, the Congo, or suffering everywhere, by the way. and I'll explain why. I had an idea a while ago about making a video about how we were in an abusive relationship with the government, but I feel like that video would be 4 hours long. This is the same concept, but broken down a little bit. We experience abuse on the micro and macro level. And as always, if this conversation's too heavy for you, please exit away and you can join me on another video. Take care of yourself. Ultimately, I care about your well-being. Abuse experienced by individuals often results in trauma that can be passed down through generations. This is probably studied by someone in some university somewhere, but in a stone thought, I came to this conclusion that many of our challenges with relationship and abuse comes directly from the transatlantic slave trade. How can we truly know what love is in America when some of us were owned? When some of us owned others? That's just me, though. Children who witness or experience abuse may internalize these behaviors and replicate them in their own relationships, perpetuating a cycle of abuse. This, of course, is not an excuse for abuse, but it's a reason. I learned a statistic that changed my life and in therapy in my early 20s that around 35% of abusers experience abuse in their lives as victims, which in turn means the majority of abuse victims in childhood or in their lives in general don't go on to perpetuate abuse later on, which means that it is an active choice abusers make.
And when you look at the wheel, on the outside you see this physical and sexual violence. And then on the inside, you see these 8 different tactics and ways in which they achieve this dominance over their partners. A lot of those tactics inside that wheel are things that might happen in other relationships that aren't battering, like emotional abuse. What changes in these relationships is when physical violence or the threat of it has been used in the relationship, it changes how those tactics play out. And then if you see that power and control in the middle, that's what he ends up with when he uses the violence and all these different tactics to dominate her. He ends up with power and control. Now, most men won't say, I want power and control over her. That wouldn't be their language. What they often end up saying is that I want her to shut the hell up. I want her to stay home. I want her to get the kids in bed. I want her to discipline the kids in the correct way. That's what he's trying to get. He has this way of trying to get her to constantly do or execute the world as he sees it. And the tactics are how he achieves that.
They, of course, don't want you to know that. They want you to think it's because of the trauma that they've experienced. When individuals grow up in environments where abuse is common, they may come to see such behaviors as normal or acceptable, increasing the likelihood of both becoming victims or perpetuators of abuse. I want to expand on this in a way that is outside of what you may initially think. As I mentioned in the last video, if you believe in the patriarchy, you will perpetuate things like misogyny, sexism, and violence because you have to in that system. In patriarchy, there is no equality, it's only hierarchy. In patriarchy, there is the dominated and the dominator. People who believe in the patriarchy will rationalize and normalize violence because to them, it is what is rational with that specific mindset. If someone has to be a loser, then it is okay if you are brutal and making sure that you're the victor. See how this mindset can expand to both the individual and the systemic level? We cannot separate feminism from the revolution because of this.
I usually find myself part of some group in which the majority defines me as deviant, difficult, inferior, or just plain wrong. From my membership in all of these groups, I have learned that oppression and the intolerance of difference come in all shapes and sizes and colors and sexualities, and that among those of us who share the goals of liberation and a workable future for our children, there can be no hierarchies of oppression. I have learned that sexism, a belief in the inherent superiority of one sex over all others and thereby its right to dominance, and heterosexism, a belief in the inherent superiority of one pattern of loving over all others and thereby its right to dominance, both arise from the same source as racism, a belief in the inherent superiority of one race over all others and thereby its right to dominance. Oh, says a voice from the Black community, but being Black is normal. Well, I and many Black people of my age can remember grimly the days when it didn't used to be. I simply do not believe that one aspect of myself can possibly profit from the oppression of another part of my identity. I know that my people cannot possibly profit from the oppression of any other group which seeks the right to peaceful existence. Rather, We diminish ourselves by denying to others what we have shed blood to obtain for our children.
Sorry to every cis-het male leftist who try to avoid reading feminist theory. It's time to crack open some books outside of Bell Hooks' All About Love to Get Laid. Try reading Feminism for Everybody, or The Will to Change if you're actually serious.
Message!
I don't want to speak about Diddy too much, but I want to address some of the takes I've seen online that perpetuate harm, rape culture, misogyny, and misogynoir. When Cassie first came out with her lawsuit, a section of the internet, including Diddy, said she was only out for his money and immediately dogged her out. It immediately reminded me of Meg Thee Stallion and how people thought immediately what she said was not real. In both cases, Cassie and Meg had to have intimate details of their domestic abuse publicized in order for people to believe them. And even still, there's a minority who still discredits them solely to antagonize them. It enraged me, but it's nothing new. I've experienced domestic violence and violence perpetuated from men in more ways than I actually can remember. When writing this script, I tried to create a mental timeline of situations, and it got overwhelming when I reached the memories of my early 20s. I blocked a lot of stuff out, honestly. My most traumatic and most recent experience was in 2020. I'm still healing from what I dealt with back then, but I bring it up to say that even in my non-celebrity, humble life, I dealt with people in my life not believing my experience, or worse, making fun of it or blaming me for it. Although I cut those people off because that harm really affected me, I do understand that they believed it was okay to say because at some point they learned that being a victim is something that you can control.
In toxic masculinity, you become a real man by doing three things: athletic skills, by dominating in that sense, by objectifying women, and by having money. Even the athletic part is really what Manny Thomas was talking about. It really comes down to violence.
At some point, they learned that being a victim is something that you can control, and that I was doing something wrong by becoming one. We keep validating the mindsets of abusers in this way because they are who's in control. They're the ones perpetuating this ideal.
And yes, we are talking more specifically about male abusers because, as we'll see in the video itself and some of the things he talks about, the way that men and boys are socialized enables a type of abuse that obviously not all men actually end up acting on. A lot of men overcome these obstacles in this type of socialization, but for those that don't, this is very much the conceptualization that Bancroft comes up with in terms of why men become abusive. Now, I will say a lot of the cognitive and behavioral pieces about why people are abusive that we're going to talk about today apply to people of all genders. It's really just the part about male socialization that is specific to men or to people who were socialized to be male. The number one and only thing that causes a person's abuse is their decision to act abusive. Abuse is caused solely by that person's decision, actions, and moral compass that is askew. It is their choices, their behaviors, their actions that cause abuse. It is never the risk factors that cause their abuse. It is never society as a whole. It is never the victim. It is always the person choosing to be abusive.
If hundreds of people on the interpersonal level are normalizing violence, then the societal acceptance of violence in interpersonal relationships can contribute to a broader culture that tolerates or even condones violence, creating an environment where larger scale acts of violence, including genocide, can occur. I hate to bring up this man, but walk with me here. A lot of leftists in general acknowledge that fascism is on the rise and that there has been an increase in right-wing support and propaganda, but no one wants to acknowledge that sexism, homophobia, and transphobia were the canaries in the coal mine.
You know, I don't want to sound too much like a chauvinist, but when I come home and dinner's not ready, I go through the roof, okay?
Disagreement, because ultimately Ivana does exactly as I tell her to do.
See, wait a minute.
Male chauvinist.
Right, men? Is that right? Huh?
Putting a wife to work is a very dangerous thing. I create stars. I love creating stars. I mean, I've really given a lot of women great opportunity. Unfortunately, after they're a star, the fun is over for me. It's like a creation process. It's almost like creating a building. It's pretty sad.
Sexism can be considered a canary in the coal mine for fascism because it often serves as an early indicator of broader authoritarian tendencies within a society. This analogy highlights how the presence and tolerance of sexism can signal the rise of more extensive, oppressive, and undemocratic practices. The overturning of Roe v. Wade and packing the Supreme Court by Donald Trump has had profound and far-reaching consequences, particularly for women, femmes, and people with wombs. The lack of substantial male support and protest and advocacy against this decision can exacerbate feelings of isolation and vulnerability.
I see tears streaming down your face. What does this mean to you today?
It feels like a betrayal. It feels like my country doesn't love me and appreciate my body as a woman. I can't even chant because I can't say anything. It hurts.
I just think nothing good comes from having sex, including children. No, I'm just kidding. I think with the overturning of Roe v. Wade and, our rights being stripped away from us, this is a way that I can take back the control. And it just sucks that it has to be in that way. But I just don't feel comfortable until things change.
And I have to really speak out and say this. I haven't seen many cishet men on the internet or in my real life say anything about Roe v. Wade. Whenever men on social media do talk about issues with women, they equate it to gender wars, which to me is a very privileged and out-of-touch take on some level. Women and femmes are angry, and rightfully so. Marginalized genders are getting their rights taken away from them, their bodily autonomy stripped from them, and cishet men on the internet are equating that to being at war with women, that we are at war with them. Being angry women don't want to date them or have sex with them right now when our lives are on the line. Being upset that women on social media are choosing a bear over them, which means that they don't feel safe. I have said this a few times in some TikTok comments to men, but I'm going to repeat it now for the whole world to hear. It is not a gender war. It's gender terrorism. Calling it a gender war is like believing in reverse racism. If men are really upset about women wanting providers, they should dismantle the patriarchy that forces the stereotype of them being only important through monetary gain. Don't yell at the women, yell at each other.
I started seeing how we as men were really destroying ourselves on some patriarchal stuff, And so it's like, imagine you're reading this stuff and you lower the book and you're seeing it, and you're seeing real violence, people getting stabbed, people getting beat up, people getting shot, and you're just we don't gotta live like this, y'all, but being too scared to say it.
Men should be advocating for universal basic income and fighting against the patriarchy that tells them that they are incapable of being a man unless they fit a certain mold. That would require too much effort, though, I suppose.
Message!
I say this is gender terrorism because as a AFAB non-binary person, I can see the authoritarian return to gender roles and gender control. Fascist regimes often emphasize traditional gender roles as part of their broader ideological framework, promoting a return to natural hierarchies where men dominate public and political life while women are regulated to domestic and reproductive roles and other genders don't exist. Nazi Germany promoted the ideal of the Aryan family with clear gender roles, men as warriors and women as mothers, and everyone else was erased. The regime actively discouraged women from working outside of the home and restricted their rights to ensure that they focused on child rearing and homemaking. While many men on the left and right laughed off Donald Trump's locker room talk, it has introduced a new emboldened era of acceptable misogyny, validated by a presidential candidate at the time, and then later a president for 4 years. People don't realize that when a president is in control of a country, they are setting the tone for the state of the country and the nation, which is why I wanted to make the we're in an abusive relationship with our government video, because if a president is openly sexist and racist, he is allowing the space for that. He's dictating that environment for the whole nation. Similarly, like with an abusive man in his household.
What changes in these relationships is when physical violence or the threat of it has been used in the relationship, it changes how those tactics play out. So for example, If a man comes home in a nonviolent relationship and announces to his wife that he's not going to do any domestic chores anymore, that would probably cause some sort of a sit-down conversation between the two of them. However, in a relationship where there's battering, if he comes home and announces that he's not going to do any domestic chores from this point forward, then she's got a lot to think about and how she wants to respond to that, because he's proven that he will use physical violence to get her to submit.
He sets the tone for how everyone will act underneath that. And with many systems of abuse, people will perpetuate harm to protect themselves from getting abused. Fascist movements frequently seek to control reproductive rights as a means of controlling the population. Restrictions on abortion, contraception, and other reproductive health services are common, including gender-affirming care. In Mussolini's Italy, policies were implemented to increase birth rates, including bans on contraception and severe restrictions on abortion, under the guise of increasing the population for national strength. In the last week, we've seen Bumble shame women for choosing celibacy, as well as the sexist commencement speech at that college.
I want to speak directly to you briefly because I think it is you, the women, who have had the most diabolical lies told to you. How many of you are sitting here now, about to cross this stage, and are thinking about all the promotions and titles you are going to get in your career? Some of you may go on to lead successful careers in the world, but I would venture to guess that the majority of you are most excited about your marriage and the children you will bring into this world. I can tell you that my beautiful wife, Isabel, would be the first to say that her life truly started when she began living her vocation as a wife and as a mother. I'm on this stage today and able to be the man I am because I have a wife who leans into her vocation. I'm beyond blessed with the many talents God has given me, but it cannot be overstated that all of my success is made possible because a girl I met in band class back in middle school would convert to the faith, become my wife, and embrace one of the most important titles of all, homemaker.
Yo, Bumble, fuck you guys for real, because are you not aware that you can be a woman who dates males and is still celibate? Or did you just completely skip over that fact? Because right now, this feels like a campaign to encourage rapists. Essentially, what you're saying is, if a male takes us on a date and buys us a dinner, we owe him our body. And if we're celibate, that's not valid. You're delegitimizing our celibacy because you want males to have more access to our bodies. And then you think that we're gonna have a positive reaction to that? You must be out of your damn mind. The fact that y'all have the audacity to push this campaign when there is a literal femicide going on in Congo right now, where women are being kidnapped by the masses and essayed by the soldiers in front of their family members, okay? Women are having to watch their daughters get raped by soldiers, okay? Is that a concept that you guys thought about before you put out this stupid fucking brainless campaign? I would not be surprised to find out that before they pushed this campaign, they fired a bunch of women from the marketing department. I bet you anything this was a male's idea, and I bet you anything they had to get rid of certain women that worked in the marketing department to be able to push this campaign, because there's no way women signed off on this campaign, and if they did, I am incredibly disappointed in you. So I'm on my Bumble app right now, and I'm deleting my account, and this is my message to you. Your campaign delegitimizing celibacy is an absolute threat to women's safety, and I will not be using an app that encourages males to be so entitled to my body that they will not respect celibacy during the dating stage. Fuck you guys.
Sexism within a society often intersects with and reinforces other forms of discrimination such as racism, homophobia, and xenophobia. These interconnected systems of oppressions are hallmarks of fascist ideologies that seek to create a homogeneous and hierarchical society. Gone are the days of us separating these issues. Gone are the days of leftist men and so-called feminist men separating these issues. Intersectionality or bust. Are you serious about dismantling capitalism? Are you ready to not be at the top of the hierarchy anymore? What are you willing to give up?
One of the most important things to address when people are committing harm against somebody else is to first explore their own trauma.
But first and foremost, we can cry. We can show emotion. And I'll be honest with you, like I tell you guys all the time, that's a courageous motherfucker who's willing to stand up and show his emotion and through tears and all, be courageous and tell their story. How many of you have badmouthed a woman before? Raise your hand if you have. How many of you have put hands on a woman before? How many have disrespected a woman before?
George Luna leads rehabilitation groups at prisons around California. He says he's been in and out of the state's correctional facilities since he was 11 years old.
Old Folsom, New Folsom, Soledad, San Quentin now, Venezolano. Once they get a hold of you, you're in, you're not going to get out for a long time, and I just kept going back all the time.
He's been out of prison for 10 years now, and in 2014, he started leading training sessions for the GRIP program, which teaches inmates about toxic masculinity. That term refers to the way traditional male roles in society can limit how men express emotion and ultimately encourage violence. Luna graduated from the GRIP program himself when he was an inmate at San Quentin State Prison. He says that's where he first learned about how trauma and violence shaped his ideas about manhood.
A society that tolerates or perpetuates violence against women and marginalized genders sets a precedent for the normalization of violence as a tool of control and intimidation, which is a key figure of fascist regimes. With every incident that everyone, but specifically men, choose to not step in and remain passive builds a culture of fascism where might makes right. Sexism undermines the principles of equality and justice that are fundamental to democratic societies. When these principles are eroded, it paves the way for authoritarianism and the centralization of power. The rise of the far-right movements in Europe and the United States often involves a backlash against gender equality initiatives, which is part of a broader agenda to undermine democratic institutions and norms. Promoting sexist ideologies can serve to distract the population and create divisions within society, making it easier for authoritarian leaders to consolidate power by turning social groups against each other. By focusing on gender issues and promoting divisive rhetoric around them, leaders can rally support among certain demographics while marginalizing and demonizing others, thus consolidating their own power base. And I fear that's exactly what's happening with men online. Even leftist men. I believe that the well is poisoned, and that even well-meaning men who are unpacking their misogyny and patriarchy have been red-pilled.
I was such a chameleon, it was really fake. Like, I would be super, Feminista Jones, and then when I would be around my homies, I was using the B word and all of that.
What did toxic masculinity look like for you growing up?
I seen my family members beat on their wives and women and stuff, and it me up. It's like that's what I thought men do.
You internalized it.
Exactly. Growing up, we've been taught through commercials, TV, all the shit. We've learned one way to think. So in the box, what would be an example of how F, what's the F stand? Here we go. What's the F stand for? Feel. So what is acceptable when you live in the box, how to feel? What would be that? Angry, there you go. Tough. Keep coming, come on. In charge, superior. And we're all guilty of this.
The rhetoric of the Andrew Tates of the world has permeated everything and everyone in mass media. Even in male feminist response videos, men are perpetuating negative ideals and are using a sexist framework. It can be pretty glaringly obvious how much feminist theory a male activist actually reads, or if they actually hang out with people of different genders, by the ways that they respond to certain things on the internet. Sexism as an early indicator of fascism underscores the importance of vigilance in protecting and promoting gender equality as part of safeguarding democratic values and human rights. For years, feminists were told that they were overreacting, but it's clear that feminists were warning everybody. When sexism is tolerated or institutionalized, it can signal broader trends towards authoritarianism, oppression, and the erosion of freedoms, making it a crucial issue to address in the fight against fascism. The overturning of Roe v. Wade has had profound and far-reaching consequences. The lack of substantial male support and protests and advocacy against this decision can exacerbate feelings of isolation and vulnerability, which in turn makes men feel vulnerable and isolated.
Once I can objectify a woman and then put a hand to her and gain that, like, see, I told you, then the ass whoopings would escalate, right, to full out beatings. I never questioned that I wasn't right.
If you want others to care about you, you must care about them. This is another reason why I say there is no gender war, but marginalized genders pushing back on gendered responsibilities. Women and gender minorities have historically been at the forefront of all gender equality movements. The overturning of Roe v. Wade reinforces the expectation that they should bear the primary burden of fighting for these rights, leading to feelings of isolation when men do not show up as allies. Femicide, sexual violence, and gender-based violence has all risen since the overturning of Roe v. Wade, yet no men are actively making these connections. The emotional labor of advocating for reproductive rights often falls disproportionately on women and gender minorities. The lack of visible male allyship can lead to a sense of abandonment. When half the population seems indifferent or absent in crucial battles for bodily autonomy, it can deepen the emotional and psychological toll on those directly affected.
It's shocking. Like, how can such an, like, this is something that women should have a right to? Like, I can't.
What we are experiencing is deep collective trauma. What we're experiencing is trust erosion, not a gender war. This absence can erode trust in male allies and deepen the divide between the genders, creating a sense of mistrust and skepticism towards men as potential supporters of gender equality, which is where we are now, and where a lot of men often will stay and remain frustrated. They do not understand why women and marginalized genders group men together when they are not abusive or harmful themselves, not realizing that some folks feel this way because your silence was deafening.
Guys, if a woman tells you she feels unsafe, stop defending yourself. Stop saying things like not all men are like that. Nobody said all men, but it's too many men. Enough men for women to feel unsafe. Enough men that almost all women have experienced it. And nobody's denying that this can happen to men too. If anything, that gives you more reasons to support women. But then why do you feel a need to defend yourself? Is there something you feel guilty about? If not, then just shut up and learn how to listen. It's the bare fucking minimum.
In the wake of Roe v. Wade's decision and dozens of trans and queer bashing bills, some women and gender minorities turn to celibacy as a means of exerting control over their bodies and reducing the risk of unwanted pregnancies in a climate where access to abortion is being restricted, which has been happening. Yet, men online are talking about how they can't get dates or feel as though folks are not interested in them when they are dating. The refusal to make connections is really disheartening to me, so I guess this is why I'm making this video. The answer is so apparent to everyone whom this affects in a country where you're more likely to go to jail if you miscarry than if you were a domestic abuser. And I think this is a good segue into the bear versus man convo really quickly, and then I'll move on because I think the men who aren't getting it are being willfully obtuse. So the metaphorical preference for feeling safer around bears than men highlights the extreme sense of danger and betrayal that some people feel. Bears as non-human animals represent a form of neutrality and predictability compared to those and the perceived threat posed by men. In the absence of reliable male allies, women and gender minorities may seek safety and solidarity in communities that understand and share their experiences, which will further isolate them from broader social interactions with men. When you hear cis-het women online say that they would feel safer with a bear than with a man, they are subtly sharing that they have been victims of abuse, that they themselves are survivors of domestic violence or sexual assault. But yet all you guys are hearing is that she would rather be murdered by a bear. The overturning of Roe v. Wade can be seen as part of a broader societal trend that emboldens abusers and undermines the rights of women and gender minorities. This societal shift can lead to an increase in sexual violence as perpetrators feel less constrained by legal and social repercussions. There's a reason why Drake, Diddy, and Donald Trump, as well as all others with allegations against them, have said with confidence that they would be in jail if they harm someone. These are very much connected. If we are in an abusive relationship with the government, this is the control that they see. The legal landscape post-Roe can create a climate of fear where survivors are hesitant to seek help due to potential legal and social repercussions, further entrenching cycles of violence and abuse.
Every relationship I was ever in was abusive. I'm a recovering person, and I'm recovering from many, many things. One of them is domestic violence.
It was always hard for survivors to speak up, but now it seems futile. I hope this is a stark reminder of the ongoing struggle for gender equality and bodily autonomy for the men who watch my channel. The lack of significant male support in this fight not only deepens the isolation felt, but also highlights the broader societal implications of such landmark decisions and big cases in the media, like of Diddy and Cassie. Widespread interpersonal violence can desensitize individuals and societies to violence, lowering the threshold for acceptance of extreme acts such as mass killings. These things are all connected. Systems that perpetuate inequality and oppression often arise from the same dynamics that underpin interpersonal abuse. Institutionalized racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination can lead to systemic abuse of certain groups, setting the stage for large-scale violence. When legal and political systems fail to protect individuals from abuse or actively participate in it, they reinforce cycles of violence that can escalate to genocidal acts. The pyramid of violence illustrates how seemingly minor acts of prejudice and discrimination can escalate severe and widespread acts of violence. The pyramid is divided into different levels, each representing increasing severity of violence, the worst being genocide and mass atrocities, but they start out on a base level of bias and stereotyping. Small, everyday acts of discrimination, such as jokes, insults, or exclusion based on race, gender, or other characteristics, leads to a culture that normalizes discrimination and devalue certain groups. The pyramid of violence shows that a genocide and mass violence are not isolated incidents, but are the culmination of a continuum of discrimination and violent behaviors that begin with seemingly minor biases and prejudices. Addressing violence at its base levels by challenging biases and promoting equality can prevent the escalation to more severe forms of violence. Understanding this pyramid helps highlight the importance of early intervention and comprehensive strategies to combat discrimination and violence at all levels. You have responsibility towards one another and towards yourself to keep yourselves in check and to always be decolonizing. I wanted to bring up another thing about Diddy, and that was his apology. For my sake and for the sake of every survivor, I will not be showing that video of Cassie or Diddy's gaslighting apology, but instead I wanted to end by breaking it down with some legitimate points. Why Does He Do That? Inside the Minds of Angry and Controlling Men by Lundy Bancroft provides deep insights into abusive behavior in intimate relationships and its broader societal implications. Abusers often use tactics such as gaslighting and manipulation to undermine their partner's sense of reality and self-worth. This emotional abuse can lead victims to feel trapped and powerless, making it difficult for them to lead the relationship and breaking their sense of identity. This trauma can persist, affecting the victim's future relationships and possibly leading them to replicate those abusive patterns or fall victim to similar abuse again, thereby perpetuating a cycle of abuse.
Now you might be saying, well, what about, people that seem to not want to be abusive, but it's more of an unconscious thing? To that I say, no one is ever abusive all of the time in every single situation that they wish they could be. There are people who are abusive at home or abusive with their intimate partner that are not abusive at work, out in public, when the police comes over. That is because they decide when to be abusive and when not to. It is very, very rarely actually a matter of they just lose control and dissociate. And even if a person is under the influence of a substance really heavily, let's say they black out, they might not remember what they did the next day, but they knew what they were doing in the moment. A person who is under the influence is more vulnerable to abuse, but it is never that substance abuse actually causes someone to become an abuser, because that's not how it works. Substances can lower your inhibitions, but what happens when your inhibitions are lowered are on you. It is your instincts that you still have to be responsible for.
Bancroft emphasizes that societal norms and cultural attitudes often tactically endorse abusive behavior. For instance, he points out how some cultural narratives glorify male dominance and control in relationships. These societal attitudes can normalize interpersonal violence, making it more likely for such behaviors to be tolerated or overlooked, thereby laying the groundwork for broader acceptance of violence. He also discusses how legal systems can fail to protect victims of abuse adequately. For instance, abusers might manipulate legal proceedings to continue exerting control over their victims, such as through contentious custody battles. When institutions fail to protect victims and hold abusers accountable, they perpetuate a cycle of systemic abuse that can escalate to larger scale violence and discrimination. He also notes that abusers often control their partner's access to financial resources, limiting their independence. This economic abuse can keep victims trapped in abusive relationships. Economic control and instability at the interpersonal level reflect and reinforce broader societal inequalities and injustices, contributing to cycles of poverty and marginalization that can fuel larger social conflicts. Bancroft describes how abusers often hold and act on deep-seated beliefs about gender roles, believing men should dominate and control women. These biases manifest in subtle behaviors like dismissive comments and controlling financial decisions. Once again, it starts with that.
I was subjected to just about every form of abuse by being in this marriage. There was always this level of emotional abuse where he would belittle me. He would remind me that I was nothing without him. And it might not seem so bad in one particular episode, but just imagine years and years and years and years of hearing that. What it did, the impact to him on my self-esteem and self-worth. I thought I couldn't do nothing on my own. Then there was the beat down. And this was a ritual. This was all consecutive. And after a while, I began to calculate it. I began to prepare myself for it.
While Bancroft's focus is primarily on interpersonal abuse, the escalation from individual acts of violence to societal acceptance of violence underpins how large-scale atrocities can develop. Societies that tolerate interpersonal violence can create an environment where extreme violence such as genocide can occur. And we've also seen mass sexual violence be perpetuated in both Gaza, Sudan, and the Congo.
Sexual violence happens everywhere in all the conflicts in the world or in other situations of violence. It is really something that is widespread and that we see happening in times of peace and therefore even more in times of conflict.
Les hommes réagissent en niant cette réalité. Ils disent que ce sont l'affaire des femmes parce que c'est la femme elle-même qui s'est fait violer. C'est pour cela que nous allons continuer en tant que volontaires à faire nos sensibilisations pour qu'un jour toute la communauté puisse être au courant et de savoir que le viol c'est quoi. Et la femme puisse avoir un jour sa place d'être femme.
Lundy Bancroft's Why Does He Do That provides a detailed examination on how abusers operate on a personal level and its broader societal implications. By understanding these dynamics, we can see how cycles of abuse affect individuals and contribute to a culture of violence, emphasizing the importance of addressing these issues on a both micro and macro level to prevent the escalation of violence. Abusive dynamics are not confined to personal relationships, but are pervasive in various sectors, including government, entertainment, and other institutions. Many authoritarian regimes perpetuate cycles of abuse through systemic oppression, surveillance, and violence against those populations. These practices create a culture of fear and compliance, suppressing dissent and perpetuating a regime's power across generations. This video is not a male-bashing video. We're not saying that only men can be abusers or perpetuate abuse. Abuse can be anyone who believes in societal hierarchies and demands power and control. But this video is gendered towards cis-het men on purpose, because it has to be.
According to the FBI, 90% of homicides are committed by men.
But this way of living and this way of thinking escalated all the way to the point to where I objectified another human being at the point of taking his life.
Men are twice as likely as women to abuse or become dependent on drugs and alcohol.
That addiction that I got at an early stage of my life carried with me everywhere I went, and wherever I go, there I was.
and men are nearly 4 times as likely to die by suicide, according to the US Department of Health and Human Services and the CDC.
So we're not just acting like this for no reason. Why do we buy into this? What are some of the payoffs we get for buying into toxic masculinity?
You get to be the boss.
Okay, you get to be the boss.
Glory.
Glory.
Reputation.
Somebody said acceptance, self-esteem. I'm gonna say pride too, because that's a good one. Now, what are the costs, the long-term costs of buying into this? Life sentence.
Life sentence.
Death.
Unsatisfied.
Loneliness.
So just based on seeing it up here, I mean, I feel like it's an obvious question, but do the payoffs seem like they're worth the cost? Absolutely not. And yet we do it all the time.
I've seen men talk about men's rights issues, but only in the context of dating online. Women and femmes are dying out here. Femicide is increasing, y'all. Since Roe v. Wade has overturned, there's been tens of thousands of sexual assaults nationwide reported. And those are just the ones reported. And I'm not saying it's y'all, but more men online have been concerned about Diddy's bisexuality than his non-consensual behavior, than his abuse against children. People have made alleged sexual assaults against men a punchline instead of calling him what he is and validating those male victims. No Diddy is the new no homo. It's the new pause. We're regressing.
How can men, again, you've gone through this so many times, but how are men most helpful as allies in a time like this?
Well, I think it's even more helpful to realize men's stake in it, because actually, if you look at the cause of male deaths, speeding and violence, and you add them all up, the women's movement and the dissolution of gender roles means that you would have about 5 more years of life to live. This is not bad.
Yeah.
Who else can make that offer?
I would love that. Yeah, that'd be wonderful.
And also getting to know your own children.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the system as it is means that frequently men are estranged from their children. And men get to be whole people by being active in the home and raising or being raised to raise children, just like we get to be whole people by being active outside the home.
The pivotal event of the civil rights movement, the Montgomery bus boycott, and Dr. King emerged as the spokesperson for that boycott. That event would not have been successful without the participation of women, Black women, poor women, women who were domestic servants. They were the people who refused to ride the bus and thus pushed the movement forward. But it is only now, more than a half century later, that we are recognizing how important it is to value women's leadership. For those who argued that feminism was obsolete as the icons of mainstream feminism grew older, they did not recognize that new waves of feminism had emerged, and that the most vibrant forms of feminism today are not what we once called mainstream white bourgeois feminism. And we could also refer to mainstream white bourgeois feminism today. But rather what is currently referred to as intersectional feminism. It is not carceral feminism, a feminism that has learned to rely on the police and prisons to solve the problems of gender violence, but rather abolition feminism. Feminism that recognizes the interconnections between gender violence and racist violence, between intimate violence and institutional violence, between individual violence and structural violence. Since the advent of feminist studies within the academic sphere and the corresponding impact of feminism on movement organizing, new approaches have developed, along with more elucidating vocabularies, more revealing analyses, and thanks to feminist scholars and organizers, we have begun to understand connections, relationalities, intersectionalities. If we fail to perceive connections, relations, intersections, crossings, junctures, coincidences, overlapping and cross-hatching phenomena, we will be forever imprisoned in a world that appears to be white and male and heterosexual and cisgender and capitalist and US-centric or Eurocentric. We have learned from feminist studies that the world is not homogeneous, that all the women are not white, that all the blacks are not men, that if we do not include racial justice and economic justice, then gender justice has not been achieved.
I used to be able to talk about feminism with my male friends and my male relatives, but even they got red-pilled to some extent, and they don't want to hear it anymore. So I guess in a way, this video is for all the things that I can't get through to them anymore. Feminism will save you too. Decolonize your minds before it's too late, because Harriet would have left some of y'all behind. I would have to oblige.